Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, we're going to be going over why I think you should actually hate Boss Ward. So if you don't know, Boss Ward is a mechanic that was recently introduced to replace damage reduction that bosses used to have. If you don't know, back in the day, bosses, whenever you dealt a very large amount of damage to them, they would get a stacking DR, like damage reduction, and this would stack the more and more and more you hit the enemy. And eventually what would happen is the enemy, you'd get him to about maybe 25% of their HP, and that would take absolutely forever to chew through, even if you were doing absurd amounts of damage. And this actually made coal, like things that killed things instantly at a percent amount of HP, very important for builds that wanted to kill bosses fast, because you'd get them to 10% HP and they would take forever to kill, but then you just coal them anyways. And that was mainly our solution around Boss DR. And Boss DR actually went through a phase where it didn't really exist for the normal average person or most people in general. And the last update in 1.0, because they reworked corruption and they made it so that bosses just have way more HP than they normally did at the amount of content that people would average do them at, right? Like, to give you an idea, most people would interact with a boss with 150% more HP, but at the same point of progression now, you deal with, I think, 300% more health and damage, and then eventually, in the turbo endgame, when you actually want to be farming favor and stuff like that, you'd be at 700% more health and damage. So bosses would get to maybe 4 to 5 times the amount of HP that they normally had if you just simply pushed corruption. And Boss DR didn't exist then, because remember, it's based on their HP. So, but then we got rid of Boss DR completely, and Boss Ward was replaced by that system. So the idea here is a boss has a bunch of checkpoints which you can damage them to, and it will pop, and they'll have a shield that gives them 75% of their HP as a shield, and it decays over I think a very long time. Actually, I'm thinking 10-20 seconds, something like that. It's an absurd amount of time it actually takes to decay the shield normally. So most of the community at this point, if you're being serious and you actually care about getting to endgame and doing enough damage to kill bosses and stuff like that, right, and playing decent builds, boss HP doesn't exist anymore. The little red bar, that's not, that doesn't matter. It's such a small amount of HP in comparison to the ward that now all bosses, they just have blue health bars instead of red health bars. That's effectively the change, at least for people who are serious. But the reason why I wanted to bring this up is because I think that Boss Ward is bad philosophically. So let's read this Reddit post that I've been waiting to read here. So here's this Reddit post. Boss shield hurts weak builds. Boss shield hurts weak builds. I tried to play Poison Mercenary and was so frustrated with this mechanic. What's the point of shield? Decay is so slow that it's better for me to wait and stop hurting the boss. On the other hand, after that, I played some meta build that one-shots bosses from one hit, and shield mechanic did nothing to this. Peak game design, question mark. Well, I don't think he's right with this discussion, because as the first few people point out, if you took all the shield health and made it HP, weak builds would be hurt more. The way it is now, you're effectively doing damage by avoiding boss attacks since it drains over time. Now, of course, even Mike decided to chime in on this as well, and this is where my point of contention starts. While this is not the case, it is a common enough misconception that we are addressing the issue. We are always working to improve balance and rein in the significant outliers in both directions, i.e. probably Falconer. Falconer is probably what he's talking about here. The shield has the exact opposite effect that you perceive it to have. So we're removing it from the mass majority of places that exist and reserving it for the biggest fight where low power builds need the most help. And this specific line is what I dislike heavily. So let me talk about it. Now, to start this discussion, let's talk about what is an ARPG and what does it mean and stuff like that, right? But before we get into that, I just want to let you know that there are going to be some negative things discussed about Last Epoch, and if you don't like negativity in any form, well, this is your opportunity to click off now, but we're going to be talking about some negative things. So ARPG in general, right? You play a character on the beach. Let's use Path of Exile as an example, right? You play a character on the beach. You have shit skills, shit gear. You're literally a hobo wearing nothing, okay? But then you progress through the game, you get mildly powerful, and you get even more powerful, and you get even more powerful. Things that you were doing before, like white maps, weren't as hard as they were early on, but now you do them and you breeze through them, right? Then you move on to yellow maps. They're a little bit harder now, you know, things don't die as quickly. But then, of course, you grind more, you refine your character more, and then you breeze through yellow maps. Then you get to red maps, and then same thing for bosses, same thing for endgame. And Last Epoch usually follows this same kind of philosophy. Now, in the past, Last Epoch had not followed this philosophy to the slightest, mainly because of boss DR. The stronger you made your character, the worse you felt on bosses, because what would end up happening is on a decent character, you would kill it in about a minute, and then you'd get double the amount of damage, and you'd kill the boss in about a minute. And, you know, all those hours you spent getting upgrades, all those hours you spent getting attack speed on your gear, capping your crit, stuff like that, are not rewarded, because turns out the boss is just going to DR to your damage. And that was very bad. Not only was that bad, but it was also absurdly bad because there was no communication to this to the player. So when I explain boss DR to an average person in my Twitch stream, they go, surprise Pikachu face, and they have no fucking idea what I'm talking about. And I bring it up and they're like, wait, that's actually in the game? That explains why this build felt so bad, but then I played this build and it felt fine. It's because it disincentivized you into actually scaling your character in a proper way. In ARPG, you want to make your character stronger, but if you're not incentivized to do so, i.e. killing bosses faster, that's a reason why you'd want to be incentivized to, of course, do that. Or you can make your character better the other way, where you make your character tankier. But normally, most people view damage as the way of improving their character, which is understandable, right? So cool, we have that down. That's what an RPG is for the most part in most, like, terminology, right? You can argue with me all you want. That's essentially how I view it, right? And boss DR was bad for this, so they changed it to boss ward. But I think boss ward's actually fine. I think it's completely fine. They have like a decent amount of HP. I think the ward decay isn't as strong as it should be, but overall, I think it's a fine system. Like, whatever, right? But my problem is the philosophy behind the system. All right, we are all playing a video game, right? Let's say player A and player B are both playing the video game. I play a character, the same character as the other player, and I end up getting better drops. This means that I'm going to have, let's say, 20% more damage, let's say, right? Which means my bosses are 20% faster. And that still works in the current system now, especially with the boss ward, as they don't have dynamically changing HP. They just have a lot of it if you want to actually chew through it, right? And of course, my friend, he didn't get as good as drops, so he has like 20% less damage than me. We don't really have that much of a different experience. And boss ward in this kind of philosophy doesn't really hurt the game that much. It's whatever, right? Who cares? It's like shaving off a few extra seconds of time. But Last Epoch is not a perfect game. There are problems with it. And the biggest problem that everyone has discussed up to a point in general is the fact that some builds just do way more damage than others in general, and that is because of how the skill system works. If you don't know, each skill, you can just put in whatever points you want in the skill tree up to 20 plus, your plus levels. And there are some skills that just have more modifiers than others. Like, for instance, Earthquake has like 10 plus more damage modifiers while also having a large amount of added damage effectiveness, and it has a decent mana cost, right? Cool. Now, Cinder Strike has little to no more damage modifiers whatsoever and a very low damage effectiveness while also having almost the same amount of mana cost as an Earthquake build. So this causes Cinder Strike to just be generically worse than Earthquake, which in theory, if you were to actually make the game better, this would not be the case. Like, for instance, Path of Exile, I'm going to bring this up again, you have the 6-link system. You have 6 links on your character in the end game, right? You have 1 skill gem and 5 skill links, right? Each skill gem gives like a certain amount of percent more damage, and every single skill has access to these buckets. Now, of course, some skills have better support gems than others, but generally you're within 6 orders of magnitude, right? i.e. 6 multiplicative modifiers on your character, right? Or 5 in this case. So for instance, you have a 40% more damage modifier on the first gem, a 40% on the second, a 40% on the third, and this meant that every single build in the end game, without of course outliers and stuff like that, generally could have the same amount of damage or are in the same ballpark. Like for instance, in Path of Exile, most builds right now in the end game, they range between 10 to 100 million DPS, depending on how much damage they have, how much investment in gear they have. But generally, they stay very close to the same. They don't change as much. Like the degrees of difference aren't as bad. But in Last Epoch, the degrees of difference are astronomical. Like utterly astronomical. I could be hitting random enemies with a Cinder Strike and dealing 500 damage, while my friend could be playing Earthquake and hitting enemies for 50,000. Like it is such a gigantic difference because some skills just have more multiplicative modifiers, which raises that order of magnitude. Like for instance, turns out if you have 50% more modifiers on your tree, versus a skill that only has 50% more modifiers on their tree, you end up with a gigantic amount of damage difference. And a lot of the game suffers from this problem. Like for instance, I have 50 bajillion damage while my friend only has 5 million damage. That's very bad, right? And this is why I think people think Boss Ward needs to exist, because there are just some builds in general that do less damage. But in my opinion, Boss Ward is only a band-aid for bad design. It is bad design to have a game like this and have these skills and have them do so little damage in comparison to other skills, right? Like for instance, why is it that I can't play just normal like shurikens anymore? Why am I forced into playing like, let's say, Umbral Blades and stuff like that? Because they just do that much more damage. Umbral Blades have more modifiers on its tree. Just in general, they have access to Shadow Daggers. There's so many other avenues of scaling that Umbral Blades has. While of course, when I play shurikens, I have a very limited amount of, very limited amount of scaling vectors that I have, right? And I have to scale it in a very specific way. There's only 2 specific ways to scale shurikens to do damage in endgame, right? I.e., you do the little line, or you do chakram. You can't just play normal shurikens in its normal state, right? Umbral Blades also has this issue, but what I'm trying to get at is the Boss Ward system exists because there are builds and skills like Vengeance that do little to no damage in comparison to skills like Torment, which do all the damage, or Falconer, which does like 2 million crits on the dummy, right? Stuff like that. It's just simply a band-aid for bad design. In this case, how damage hasn't been normalized across the board. Why does, like, let's say, I don't know, I'm trying to think, like, why does Earthquake have like 10 more damage modifiers while Forge Strike only has a few? Forge Strike is a bad skill. And the reason why it's a bad skill, well, not only because it's on Sentinel, but it's also because it has more damage multipliers. It doesn't matter how much investment you put in your character, no matter how much scaling you try to do, no matter how good of gear you have, you'll never meet the same amount of damage that an Earthquake build has, because of the fact that the Earthquake build has access to 2 extra more damage modifiers inside of its tree, which ends up being almost double your damage, or if not triple your damage. And this ends up being the problem in endgame, because you have skills that do damage, are allowed to do damage by design, and skills that aren't allowed to do damage. And this is why Boss Ward, to me, in my opinion, is a band-aid, and it's bad design, in my opinion. I think that it doesn't need to exist. In a world where the game is actually balanced in a way where like damage across the board isn't as crazy. Now, of course, you can have some magnitudes of difference. Like for instance, you have a skill that does 20% more damage than the others, 40% more, right? Like for instance, in Hearthstone, a good example here is if you have a deck that's better than everyone else's, generally you're within 10% of extra win rate as the others. Like for instance, let's say a normal build, a normal deck has a 50% win rate. Your deck, if you If you have a really good one and it's really overpowered, you'd have like a 60% win rate. That is what is regarded as overpowered in Hearthstone. If we were to use these terms and bring them into Last Epoch, you'd have like a Cinder Strike build, which has a 48% win rate, which is very bad, by the way, mind you. You'd have a 48% win rate, while Torment has like a 70% win rate or an 80% win rate. That's the amount of numbers and differences and variance that we're dealing with here. Like, if you ever like have studied statistics before and understand what a median is, the median is all over the place, right? It's just all over the place. What is a low power build and what is a high power build is such a significant margin of difference that it requires a boss to have 5 times its amount of HP to maintain a semblance of balance. Like, for instance, if I am playing a Cinder Strike build, and I'm doing like a decent amount of damage, right? I was like, whatever, like we're killing the boss, right? But then my friend, he's playing like, let's say a Falconer. He's going to chew through the boss significantly faster while also having it have 5 times the amount of HP, while I hit a boss and I have to wait 5 years for the boss word to go away because Cinder Strike does no damage, right? There's no world where that should be the case. If your build sucks, it should be because you made it suck. What do I mean by that? Well, if you didn't optimize your build, if you didn't like optimize your gear, if your gear isn't as good, if you didn't spend as long playing the character, stuff like that, that is why your character should suck. Not because of predetermined things that happened to the game before you even clicked the character creation thing, right? Like, for instance, imagine the difference of fun that 2 people have. Like, let's imagine one person, they log in and they create a character like, wow, this, let's think here. This vengeance skill is pretty cool. I want to use it into endgame, right? Now, let's go to option number B. Let's say, oh, wow, dive bomb. This is pretty good skill, right? It's pretty cool. Let me play that to endgame. Who's going to have a better experience, right? And that right there is what the problem is. Not boss ward, not boss DR, none of this nonsense. Like, it's not the boss ward that is causing the problem. What's causing the problem is there are some skills that have 50 billion more damage modifiers while other skills don't. Like, for instance, mechanically, Cinder Strike is a fine skill. I think the Burning Dagger should pierce enemies. Please, EHG, if you're listening to me, please make the Burning Daggers pierce, for the love of God. The Burning Daggers are cool. The Cinder Strike combo stuff is cool. Like, its tree is cool, but the reason why people don't play it and people don't have fun with it is because it doesn't have more damage modifiers in it. It just doesn't do damage. There's a lot of skills in Last Epoch that are cool thematically, but they just don't do damage, so people don't like them. Like, for instance, Aura of Decay. Aura of Decay is a good example of a skill that everyone loves. Whenever I get constant barrages of people asking me, Dread, when are you going to play Aura of Decay? When are you going to play Aura of Decay? Isn't Aura of Decay cool? Aura of Decay is a cool skill, right? And I tell them, no, because it does no damage. Thematically, it's cool. The idea of poisoning yourself to do a poison AoE and to do damage, that's a cool idea. Does no damage. Doesn't matter. Like, literally doesn't matter. Like, for instance, I remember a time where Judgment Consecrated Aura was a shit skill because it just did no damage, but then immediately they made it deal damage and everyone enjoyed it after that. It's crazy how simple of a problem that this is trying to solve. Like, for instance, Flurry. Flurry is a really cool skill mechanically. You attack really fast and you can do it in AoE, or you can do it with a bow, you can shoot multi-shot out, like stuff like that. That's cool, but it's being hampered by low damage scaling in comparison to everything else in the game. Now, they can fix this by either reducing the amount of damage that the outliers are doing, or buff the other ones, or both. To be honest, you could do both. And what ends up happening is they're going to have to spend a lot of time messing with these dials, trying to bring everything in order, because they accidentally put a few extra more damage modifiers on this tree and that tree and stuff like that, right? And like, I don't know how you can balance this in a way. Like, for instance, like, imagine in Path of Exile, let's say your skill gem has access to 2 links, right? Cool. But then Ethan's over here, right? He has access to six skill slots. What if you had a skill gem that had access to 11 links? How do you balance that versus the 3 link player, right? The 3 link player is going to feel awful. And that's what's going to end up happening in the end when, they're going to struggle with balancing the game because, everyone's running around with different magnitudes of damage. They can't balance the boss HP because if you make the bosses have too much HP to keep up with people who have 11 links, the people who have 3 links, i.e., Joe over here with Cinder Strike, he's going to have a terrible time. And that's what Boss Ward has become, is a way to try to remedy this, while I'm just sitting here saying, like, why don't you just normalize the damage so that people actually do within the same magnitude? You can even have it be crazy, like 50% more damage maybe than the opposition, but not like 800% more damage. I feel like that's just kind of absurd. But yeah, that's just my opinion. That's why I don't like Boss Word. I just don't like the philosophy behind it. With all that being said, this has been Dread. I'll have to go do something else.